She wasn't just the fifth wife of Henry VIII. She was a teenage girl, groomed by her family, used by the crown, and executed by a system designed to destroy women like her. They called her reckless, a temptress, a traitor. But what if Catherine Howard was something else entirely? What if she was the perfect victim of the most powerful grooming ring in British history, one that wore crowns instead of masks, and used royal marriage instead of back alley abduction? Because Catherine didn't grow up dreaming of a throne. She grew up being passed between adults who saw her not as a child, but as a future pawn. At 13, she was preyed upon by her much older music tutor, a man entrusted with her education. And instead of protection, she was taught to smile, to flirt, to survive. Her story didn't begin in a palace. It began in a dormitory where noble girls were taught how to behave, not like leaders, but like gifts. And by the time she caught Henry VIII's eye, the trap was already set. This wasn't just a scandal, it was protocol. This wasn't betrayal, it was a blueprint, a system of grooming, silencing, and executing girls whose only mistake was being beautiful in the wrong room. And when that system was finished with her, they made sure she died perfectly. Because yes, Catherine Howard rehearsed placing her head on the executioner's block. Not because she feared death, but because she was taught that even in death, she had to be graceful, that her final performance mattered more than her life. She wasn't killed for infidelity. She was destroyed for not fitting into the fantasy of a broken king and a bloodstained monarchy. And what you'll hear at minute 12 will change the way you think about justice, power, and what we've been taught to call history. They called her Queen, but Catherine Howard was never in control. Before the crown, before the scandal, before the blade, she was a girl. And long before anyone asked what she had done, no one ever asked what had been done to her. Catherine's story begins in a fractured home. Born around 1523 to Lord Edmund Howard, a man of noble blood but shallow pockets, she was the daughter of failure. Her father, disgraced and impoverished, vanished into diplomatic obscurity. Her mother died when she was young. Catherine was discarded into the care of her step-grandmother, the Dowager Duchess of Norfolk. But the Duchess's household at Lambeth was no safe haven. It was a finishing school for fragile ambition, a noble hothouse where aristocratic girls were shaped into future wives, not future women. And Catherine, barely more than a child, was thrown into the dormitory, unsupervised, unprotected, and unknown. It was here, behind the embroidered curtains and cold stone walls, that the damage began. At 13, she met Henry Mannix. He was her music tutor, older, experienced, and fully aware of the power imbalance. What followed wasn't a love story. It was textbook grooming, flattery, secrecy, and slow erosion of boundaries. He fondled her under the guise of affection. He wrote her notes, told her to keep quiet, and reminded her that love meant obedience. And Catherine, who had been taught her worth was defined by how pleasing she could be, complied. No one stopped it, no one intervened. The adults looked away. The whispers were ignored. Mannix's behavior wasn't condemned, it was normalized. In a house where boundaries were blurry and surveillance was selective, a child's trauma was just another inconvenient rumor. When that relationship cooled, Catherine was barely 14. And then came Francis Derham, a gentleman of the household, charming, persuasive, and perhaps more dangerous than Mannix. With Derham, Catherine entered into what she believed was a courtship. He called her wife, gave her gifts, shared a bed. In her teenage mind, it may have felt like love, but Derham wasn't naive. He knew the consequences, he knew the risks, and still he persisted. Years later, this period, these stolen secret nights, would be used to destroy her. Letters she wrote as a child would become evidence. Conversations she couldn't remember would be twisted into confessions. The question wasn't whether she understood the implications, but whether anyone cared. So when history tells us Catherine Howard had a past, we must ask, who created that past? Who gave it to her? And who stood by while it happened? Because this isn't just a story of youthful mistakes. It's a systemic failure, a blueprint for exploitation. Her household didn't just fail her, it trained her, taught her how to be charming, how to smile through discomfort, how to accept attention without questioning motives. So when she later arrived at court as a teenager, surrounded by whispers and power, is it any wonder she was unequipped to navigate it? And when her beauty caught the eye of the King of England, a man 3 decades her senior, whose leg was rotting and whose paranoia ran deeper than his veins, was it seduction or inevitability? Because this is where the pivot happens. This is where innocence becomes strategy, not on Catherine's part, but on the part of those around her. The Howard family saw her not as a girl, not as a survivor, not even as a niece. They saw her as an opening, an opportunity, a pawn in silk shoes. Her uncle, the Duke of Norfolk, had already seen one niece rise to the throne, Anne Boleyn, and fall, decapitated. Now he was ready to roll the dice again. Catherine was placed directly in Henry's path, not by accident, but by design. She was given new dresses, taught new manners, and above all, coached to play the role. Be sweet, be silent, be seductive, but never ever say no. And Catherine, still clinging to the idea that obedience meant survival, obeyed. By the time she became Queen of England, she was still just 17. She wasn't stepping into a throne. She was walking into a minefield, one designed by her own blood. But the most dangerous part wasn't the king. It was the belief, shared by everyone around her, that Catherine owed her crown to the men who placed it there. And that meant she owed them her silence, her loyalty, her life, if necessary. And it would be, because the moment she failed to follow their script, when she laughed too freely or spoke too intimately with a man not the king, the same system that groomed her began sharpening its knives. Catherine Howard wasn't reckless. She was a product, carefully shaped, intensely marketed, and when the packaging wore thin, ruthlessly discarded. Catherine Howard didn't walk into the lion's den. She was escorted there, groomed, dressed, and delivered by the very people who should have protected her. By 1539, the Tudor court was no longer a palace of grandeur. It was a pressure cooker of paranoia and rot. Henry VIII was approaching 50. He was obese, foul-tempered, his leg ulcers infected and reeking. His once formidable body had become a cage of festering wounds and crumbling pride. The king was aging, and worse, he knew it. But for the ambitious, that meant opportunity. The Howards knew this game. They had played it before. Anne Boleyn, Catherine's cousin, had once been the family's golden ticket. She had risen like lightning and fallen just as fast, her head severed by the same royal favor that had crowned her. But the Howard name wasn't known for caution, it was known for calculation. So when Henry's marriage to Anne of Cleves soured, when he took one look at her and sneered, "I like her not," the Howards saw their chance. They didn't need love, they needed leverage. Catherine, barely 17, was placed in the Queen's household, not by chance, but by design. She became a maid of honor to Anne of Cleves, strategically positioned within the king's line of sight, a living, breathing antidote to everything he hated about his current wife. Where Anne was foreign, plain and stiff, Catherine was young, English, and vivacious. Catch the king's eye, then keep it. She was told how to dress, how to look at him, how to laugh at the right moment. Not too loud, not too bold, just enough to make an old man feel alive again. They didn't send her to court. They sent her to seduce, and it worked. Henry was mesmerized. Here was a girl who called him handsome, who danced with ease, who smelled of roses instead of rot. She was the dream he needed to forget his decaying body, and the nightmare she didn't yet know she was walking into. Because behind the smiles and the silks was a man unraveling, a king who had broken from the Catholic Church, dissolved monasteries, and killed 2 wives. His court was a labyrinth of whisperers and survivors, and Catherine was too fresh to smell the blood on the marble. But the Howards, they knew, and still they pushed. What kind of family feeds their daughter to a man who had executed her cousin? Answer: the kind that sees blood as an investment. Catherine became queen within weeks of Henry's annulment. There was no courtship, no real conversation, just obsession, a royal wedding that looked like victory, but felt more like a contract, one signed in silk and sealed in silence. From that moment on, Catherine didn't belong to herself. She belonged to the role. Her uncle, the Duke of Norfolk, expected loyalty. Her family expected compliance. Her very survival depended on playing a part she never auditioned for. Smile, obey, conceive. Because make no mistake, this wasn't marriage. It was monarchy. And Catherine's womb was now a matter of state. But when the expected heir didn't come, the smiles began to fade. Catherine had been built up to be the king's redemption. But in a court that ran on outcomes, she was now a liability. And worse, still radiant, still young, still drawing eyes. To Henry, that made her dangerous. To the Howards, it made her disposable. Every glance she exchanged, every word she spoke, every man who dared come near her was a potential dagger in the king's pride. And still, no one told her to stop. No one warned her that admiration could look like treason. No one explained that surviving Henry meant becoming invisible. But Catherine had been taught only to charm, not to vanish. As the court's mood turned, the once glorious union began to curdle. The very traits that had elevated her, youth, liveliness, beauty, became threats. Suspicions whispered into corridors, spies dispatched, letters intercepted. The machine had begun to turn, and once it turned, it would not stop. Because when a king suspects betrayal, he doesn't ask questions. He makes examples. To the world, Catherine Howard had it all: jewels, silks, titles, and the most powerful husband in Europe. But behind the gold-embroidered veils of power, she was suffocating. From the moment the crown touched her head, the fairy tale cracked. Henry VIII hadn't married a queen. He had married a mirror. And Catherine, barely out of girlhood, was expected to reflect back a lie: that the king was still youthful, still desirable, still in command of his legacy. But Henry was none of those things. He was bloated, bitter, and broken. The stench of his ulcerated leg filled every corridor he limped through. His moods shifted like a thunderstorm, violent, erratic, and impossible to predict. Catherine was not just a wife. She was now his proof of masculinity, and that proof came with impossible stakes. Her body was now public property, its purpose narrowed to a single task: produce an heir. Fast. And when months passed with no child, the whispers began. Was she barren? Was the king too old? Or worse, was the young queen already looking elsewhere? Catherine, raised to perform rather than question, had no playbook for what came next. She threw herself into her role, attending court functions, playing hostess, smiling until her face ached. She granted mercy to prisoners, gave gifts to the poor, tried to show compassion, but compassion in Henry's court was weakness, and weakness made you a target. Worse, her very kindness became suspect. Every glance, every word, every man who lingered too long in her presence. The palace was no longer a place of celebration. It was a maze of surveillance. Spies crept behind tapestries. Servants carried secrets like coins. Every doorway could lead to betrayal. The real scandal wasn't who Catherine looked at. It was how many people were already watching her. The king's paranoia had metastasized into policy. He'd already killed 2 wives, one for adultery, one for disappointing him. And with his own body failing, Henry's gaze turned increasingly inward, hunting for treason not in armies, but in glances. Catherine's room was watched, her words recorded, her servants bribed. Men in the king's privy chamber, especially one named Thomas Culpeper, became objects of obsessive scrutiny. Culpeper was young, handsome, ambitious, and dangerously close to the queen. Whether their relationship was romantic, flirtatious, or simply friendly remains debated. But in the eyes of the court, speculation was enough. When proximity itself is treason, innocence becomes impossible. And Catherine? She didn't understand the game had changed. She had been trained to smile, to entertain, not to survive a palace that had turned into a courtroom. She began sending letters, small notes, intimate, yes, treasonous. That depends on who's reading. Her words, "It makes my heart die to think I cannot always be in your company." To a jealous husband, that was a knife. To Henry VIII, it was war. But the court needed more. A scandal needed architecture. Enter Jane Boleyn, Lady Rochford, the woman who had once helped destroy Anne Boleyn, and now, astonishingly, was guiding her cousin-in-law into the same shadowed path. Jane was no stranger to tragedy nor to survival. She had watched heads roll, and somehow she stayed standing. Whether she believed she was helping Catherine or tightening the noose is unclear, but she carried messages, arranged meetings, facilitated access, and that was all it took. In Henry's court, love was not a crime, but secrets were. Catherine's downfall didn't begin with a kiss. It began with a system that had been waiting for her to slip. And when she did, barely, perhaps innocently, it pounced. By late 1541, the walls had ears, and they had heard enough. Informants whispered to reformist leaders, men like Archbishop Cranmer, who saw in Catherine not just a scandal, but an opportunity. She was Catholic-leaning. The Howards were a threat. Her destruction would cleanse the court and tilt the balance toward Protestant power. It wasn't just personal, it was political. Henry received the allegations as if slapped. First denial, then rage, then silence. And that silence was deadly. When Henry stopped speaking, heads usually rolled. Catherine Howard's greatest crime may not have been betrayal, but being betrayed first. By November 1541, the sweet-faced queen who had once lit up the court with her youth and laughter was now imprisoned in her own rooms at Hampton Court, surrounded not by ladies-in-waiting, but by spies and silence. The same courtiers who once bowed low and praised her beauty now avoided eye contact. The air around her thickened with suspicion. Something had shifted, and Catherine felt it in her bones. But she didn't yet know the full weight of what was coming. The tipping point came not from a seasoned politician, but from a relatively minor figure, John Lascelles, a Protestant reformer. His sister Mary Hall had served alongside Catherine years earlier in the Dowager Duchess's household, and Mary knew things. She had witnessed the young Catherine with Francis Derham, letters, whispers, possibly even promises of marriage. Lascelles brought these stories to Archbishop Thomas Cranmer, a man with his own agenda. Cranmer, a cautious yet calculating figure, saw in Catherine not just a fallen woman, but a wedge. Her downfall would destroy the powerful Catholic Howard faction and reinforce the Protestant hold on the king's inner circle. So Cranmer didn't speak to Henry directly. He left a letter on the king's pew during a church service, a silent bomb. Henry VIII read it and unraveled. First came denial, then white-hot rage. But most terrifying of all was the third phase, cold calculation. He ordered an investigation. Here's the twist the history books don't highlight. Henry never heard Catherine's side. Not really, he never confronted her, never allowed a full defense. Because by then, the question wasn't, did she do it? It was, how badly will this reflect on me? And that made the outcome inevitable. Francis Derham was arrested first. Under brutal torture, he admitted to a past relationship with Catherine, complete with vows and intimacy. But he insisted it had ended before she became queen. He had been promised marriage, he claimed, and if that was true by the standards of Tudor law, Catherine's marriage to Henry could be considered invalid, or worse, treasonous. Then came Thomas Culpeper. Dragged in chains, he denied adultery, said they only intended to sin, that yes, they met in secret, that yes, they exchanged letters. But no, the relationship had never been consummated. The problem? His words came from a body broken under torture, and torture doesn't seek truth, it extracts confession. Lady Rochford, Jane Boleyn, was also arrested. She had facilitated the secret meetings. Her role mirrored what she had done years earlier, feeding testimony against her sister-in-law, Anne Boleyn. And now history repeated itself. Jane once again stood at the center of a queen's destruction, but this time something was different. Jane didn't just face charges, she faced a breakdown. Reports describe her as hysterical, nearly catatonic, and under English law at the time, insanity could protect a person from execution. So what did Parliament do? They changed the law. They passed a statute declaring that mental illness was no longer a defense against treason, just to ensure Jane could be put to death. That was the system Catherine was trapped in. It wasn't about evidence. It wasn't about justice. It was about preserving the king's pride and eliminating anyone who threatened it. And Catherine? She was now cornered, stripped of power, stripped of allies, isolated in her apartments. her possessions inventoried, her rooms ransacked. The crown that once adorned her head was now a liability, the evidence of a deception that Henry refused to believe was his own doing. She was interrogated repeatedly, confused and terrified. Her story shifted under pressure. She admitted to the past with Derham, denied adultery with Culpeper, tried to explain the impossible truth. She had been a child, groomed, used, manipulated. But there was no room for nuance. The law wasn't after understanding, it wanted closure, quickly. And just when you thought the cruelty had peaked, another twist. The law changed again. After Catherine's arrest, Parliament passed a bill. From now on, any woman who married the king must confess her entire sexual history. Failure to do so would be treason, retroactively. In other words, Catherine was criminalized not for adultery, but for not volunteering her teenage trauma. The very system that failed to protect her as a girl now condemned her as a liar. And in doing so, it codified control over every woman who might wear the crown next. Because this wasn't just about Catherine. It was about precedent. It was about ensuring no future queen would dare hold secrets, opinions, or autonomy. It was about rewriting the rules of power and sealing them in blood. Catherine Howard didn't die at 19. She was never truly allowed to live. By the time she was led to the scaffold on that cold February morning in 1542, the girl who once lit up the Tudor court with youth and warmth had already been erased, piece by piece, by the very machine that crowned her. Her execution was swift, her silence permanent. Her story, twisted into scandal, branded into shame. But look closer and you'll see the truth. She wasn't a seductress. She was a system sacrifice, a child groomed in noble halls, a teenager handed over to a decaying king, a queen destroyed not for who she loved, but because she was too young, too pretty, too inconvenient. And even in death she performed. Catherine rehearsed laying her head on the block, not out of fear, but because she was taught her final moment must be beautiful, because even her death had to serve someone else's narrative. This wasn't just Tudor justice, it was power without conscience. And it asks us today, how many Catherines have we erased because their stories were too uncomfortable to believe? So before we label her reckless or unfaithful, ask yourself, was she reckless? Or was she a teenager trapped in a royal grooming ring disguised as a marriage? Was she unfaithful? Or was she just human? History remembers the crown, but it forgets the girl. Let's change that. If Catherine's story made you think differently about power, about consent, about how we judge women in history, drop your thoughts in the comments. Subscribe for more untold truths behind royal lies, and share this with someone who still believes she was just the flirty wife who got caught. Because history only changes when we stop believing the version written by those who survived it.